Welcome. You've made it to this quiet moment. The world has slowed down and the noise of the day has softened. Let your thoughts ease and your breath settle into a gentle rhythm. Tonight, we're going to drift back through time, far from the neon lights, the endless emails, and the hum of modern life. We're heading into the dense, cobbled heart of 18th century London. But this isn't a story about kings and queens, about empire or palaces. No. Tonight, we walk a quieter, more forgotten path. We'll be wandering into a space most historians brush past, a space built not for glory but for containment. For shame. For debt. Imagine yourself in an era where poverty wasn't simply a personal hardship, it was a criminal state. You owed money? You lost more than your possessions. You lost your freedom. The system did not offer understanding or leniency. Instead, it offered cold stone, iron bars, and a cell to think things over. One night could feel like eternity. But tonight, we're only going to stay for a little while. Don't worry, you're safe here. You're just a quiet observer, wrapped in warm blankets, your head resting on a soft pillow, listening to the story unfold. You're not truly behind those bars. But your imagination may slip between them just long enough to glimpse the rhythm of their lives, the murmur of the past. Let's begin with the world beyond the walls, the bustling streets that fed the prison's belly. Because to understand the debtor's prison, we must first understand the London that surrounded it. The sun rises slowly over the River Thames, the water thick with mist and the scent of coal smoke. Barges creak as they move along the river's edge, their wooden hulls brushing against the stone embankments. The city wakes not with silence, but with the layered noise of life, vendors calling, hooves striking cobblestones, and distant church bells pealing in uneven rhythm. You walk slowly, your shoes damp from last night's drizzle, the air holding the lingering scent of soot, sweat, and stale beer. London is a patchwork of wealth and ruin, a city where gentlemen in powdered wigs walk just steps from barefoot children rifling through trash piles. In neighborhoods like Covent Garden and St. Giles, poverty has woven itself tightly into the city's seams. Every street tells a different story. Turn a corner, and you might pass a townhouse with shining brass fixtures and liveried servants. Turn again, and you're in an alley choked with refuse, where rags flutter from the windows of overstuffed tenements. The contrast is not subtle. It is sharp. It is constant. And beneath it all, there is a quiet tension, debt. It stalks the butcher with slow weeks, the dressmaker who lost a noble client, the once wealthy gentleman who bet his last coin on a bad investment. There are no credit cards, no bankruptcy protections, no lifelines. You fall behind, and the city knows. Your creditors know. And soon, the marshals will know too. Londoners live with the ever-present possibility of being taken away, not for theft or violence, but for owing money. As strange as it may seem today, the law does not separate moral failings from financial ones. To owe is to sin. To be unable to pay is to be punished. And so, scattered throughout this sprawling, smoke-fogged city are the prisons. They rise like silent sentinels, often hidden behind walls and gates, but always there. Waiting. Watching. Among them is the most infamous of all, Fleet Prison. Tucked behind the clamour of Farringdon Street, the Fleet stands as a looming stone monolith, its outer walls blackened with soot and age. From the outside, it might pass for a warehouse or even a minor fortress, its barred windows peeking out like eyes too tired to blink. It is not a prison in the way you might imagine today. There are no long rows of uniform cells, no orange jumpsuits, no guards with radios. It is something much more chaotic, and in many ways, far more personal. Fleet Prison houses debtors, not murderers or thieves, though occasionally they share quarters. but tailors, booksellers, servants, widows, and bankrupt bankers. Men and women. Families, even. Some arrive in disgrace, some in confusion, some simply because a missed payment became a snowball that couldn't be stopped. And life within its walls is not fixed or orderly. There is hierarchy even here. Those with means may buy private rooms. Those without may be pressed into open, foul-smelling wards. Corruption thrives, and everything has a price. Even bread, even a bucket of water, even the right to sleep without being harassed. But before we step inside those walls, let us pause. Let's spend a little more time just outside, watching the rhythm of London life. You hear the cry of the pie seller, his voice rasping as he walks with a battered tray hung around his neck. Children dart between carts, some laughing, others thin and silent. A woman sings a sad tune under her breath as she stirs a pot of grey porridge. The streets are never still. The wheels turn, the coal burns, and all the while, the city tightens its grip on those who fall behind. Let your mind drift along the narrow alleys, past the pawnshops and workhouses, past the grimy pubs and hidden gardens. This is the ecosystem that feeds the prisons. These are the streets where debts are born, promises are broken, and futures become forfeit. Now, as twilight begins to descend, the shadows stretch long. A knock sounds at a narrow door. A man stands with a scroll, a badge, and a grim expression. A name is read. A debt is confirmed. There is no escape. And so, one more soul is added to the prison's tally. In the next part of our journey, we'll step through the great iron gate and into the world within. We'll explore the life of a debtor from the moment the door locks behind them, and see what it truly means to spend a night in London's most notorious prison. But for now, let your breathing slow. You're not in the prison. Not really. You're simply watching it through the veil of history, wrapped in the warmth of the present. Imagine yourself standing in the waning light of an overcast London evening. The air is damp, the sky a dim grey canvas, and the scent of coal smoke drifts heavily through the streets. A faint drizzle clings to your coat, soaking through slowly, insistently. You're not running. You're not shouting. There's no great commotion. Just the quiet, somber arrival of one more person into the belly of the city's cruelest institution, the Fleet Prison. A constable walks ahead of you, boots slapping against the slick cobbles, his pace steady but unhurried. He knows these steps well. He's taken hundreds of men down this path, maybe thousands. You hear the jangle of his keys, the creak of leather, and behind you, perhaps the rustle of your own weary footsteps. Your offense? Not a violent crime. Not theft. Not even deception, in the usual sense. Just a ledger entry. A few unpaid debts. A missed payment here, a loan defaulted there. The people who lent you the money, friends, tradesmen, sometimes strangers, had no choice but to take you to court. It's just business. It always is. And now, you're here. The Fleet Prison looms ahead like a beast with no face. You notice the iron gate first, tall, rust-spotted, and set deep between two crumbling stone walls. Above it, faintly visible through soot and grime, is a worn stone carving, Fleet Prison. No pretension. No mystery. Just cold, blunt fact. The turnkey greets you with a glance, nothing more. He's not cruel, not overtly. But he is practiced. His face is unreadable, his movements economic. With a nod from the constable, he accepts you. A name is written in a thick book with a quill. Ink scratches faintly in the background. You are now part of the record. Before entering, your pockets are searched. Not for weapons. Not for contraband. For money. Everything here costs something. If you have coins tucked into your hem, or pinned behind a button, they'll find them. The more you have, the easier your stay will be. A better cell. A bed, perhaps. A blanket that hasn't been used for 5 other prisoners before you. If you're truly fortunate, you might be able to bribe your way into a rules room. A private chamber, scarcely more than a cupboard, but worlds better than the common ward. But if your pockets are empty, if your shame is not only your debt, but your poverty, then your path will be different. You are led down a narrow passage, walls sweating with moisture, lit dimly by tallow candles sputtering in sconces. The air thickens. Not just with humidity, but with a certain kind of despair. A kind of human weight that clings to the very stones. The sounds begin to rise as you descend further. Not screams, this isn't a dungeon. But voices. Laughter, sometimes. Arguing. Weeping. The clatter of tin cups. The shuffling of feet. You hear someone coughing, a deep, rasping sound that seems to echo too long. You pass by several locked doors. Behind one, someone plays a fiddle. The tune is lively, but the strings are slightly out of tune. It creates an eerie dissonance, almost cheerful, almost menacing. Behind another, someone is preaching. Not loudly, not angrily. Just a soft, rhythmic sermon that blends into the shadows of the corridor. Finally, the turnkey stops before a heavy wooden door. He knocks once, not as a courtesy, but as a warning. Then he pushes it open. The room you enter is long and low-ceilinged. It smells faintly of urine, old straw, and spoiled food. Thin shafts of moonlight filter through barred windows high on the wall, casting silvery beams across the floor. Around the edges of the room are makeshift sleeping pallets, bundles of rags, sometimes just naked wood. The center of the room is open space, and in it, a dozen men linger, some seated, some lying down, some pacing restlessly. Heads turn as you enter, but only briefly. New faces are common here. No one asks your name. No one offers a hand. You are not a visitor. You are a debtor. There is no guard stationed in the room. The prison runs not on force, but on order. An order maintained by bribes, social rules, and fear. A man in the far corner eyes you quietly, his boots newer than the others, a faint ring of soot around his collar. You get the sense that he's watching, not in hostility, but in calculation. Perhaps he trades favors. Perhaps he rents out sleeping space. Nothing is free. You find a spot near the wall. You set down your coat as a makeshift pillow. The floor beneath you is stone, but it's warmer than outside. Slightly. Your muscles ache. Not from a long day's work, but from a longer day's anxiety. You've heard stories of this place. The common side, where the poorest prisoners sleep in filth. The master's side, where for a few pounds a month, you might rent a room with a door. The taproom, where beer flows and deals are struck. The chapel, where forgiveness is offered, but not for free. The turnkey leaves. The door closes with a soft but final click. You are no longer just a Londoner in trouble. You are now part of a different society, one governed not by law, but by custom, reputation, and coin. And yet, even here, life persists. A man in the corner begins to hum. Another fiddles with a book of psalms, the corners ragged and damp. 2 men whisper about news from outside, the war, the market, a scandal involving a bishop. They are not monsters. They are not even criminals, in the modern sense. They are tailors, bakers, clerks, musicians, widowers, and wayward sons. They carry stories, regrets, half-written letters, and debts they cannot repay. And so do you. The night stretches ahead, uncertain and long. You do not know what sleep will bring. Rats rustle behind the walls. Someone near you snores softly. And in the silence, the prison breathes. Slowly. Relentlessly. When you are ready, we will explore further. Next, we'll step into the personal story of one such prisoner. A man who came to the Fleet not because of theft or vice, but because of ambition and misfortune. In the next segment, we'll meet Samuel Giddens, a failed bookseller whose night in the Fleet became a quiet testimony to a forgotten life. Imagine, if you will, a modest shop nestled on a narrow London lane, its windows dusty, its shelves crowded with books stacked too deep. The air inside smells of ink, paper, and candle wax. The floorboards creak with every footstep, and the only light filters through a grimy windowpane, painting the room in muted amber. This was once the domain of Samuel Giddens, a bookseller by trade, and a hopeful man by nature. Samuel was not born into wealth. His father was a cobbler, his mother a laundress. But from an early age, he had a quiet hunger for learning. He'd linger near the grammar school windows, catching stray words of Latin and philosophy. He saved his coins, apprenticed with a printer, and eventually opened a tiny shop with more dreams than customers. His shelves held volumes both new and old, sermons, travel journals, moral essays, pamphlets from the colonies, and dog-eared copies of Shakespeare and Milton. On good weeks, he might sell 2 or 3 books. On bad weeks, none. Still, he persevered. He was not foolish, merely optimistic. But optimism doesn't always settle accounts. Samuel's debt began modestly. A loan from a cousin to purchase a second-hand press. Then, paper bought on credit. Then, binding services, a new sign for the door, candles, coal, ink. The numbers added up slowly, like water seeping through floorboards, unnoticed until too late. He tried everything. A pamphlet sale. A broadside printing for a local minister. He even rented shelf space to a young poet who paid in verse instead of coin. But foot traffic dwindled, and the printer across the square undercut his prices. The bills grew. The rent lapsed. And then came the final knock. It was a Tuesday morning. Damp, with a sky like pewter. The bailiff arrived quietly, no drama, no shouting. Just a thin man in a brown coat, holding a folded parchment and a slight frown. Samuel had been named in court. He hadn't even known. He hadn't attended. The result was already written. Samuel was given 15 minutes to gather his things. He took a psalter, his penknife, a cracked tea mug, and a faded letter from a woman in Bath, he never said who. Then he was walked, slowly and without ceremony, through the streets he once walked with pride, past his shuttered shop, and through the doors of the Fleet. He was not angry. He was not desperate. Just quiet. That first night, he was placed in a ward with 16 other men. Most were younger. One was missing 3 toes. Another claimed to be a cousin of the Earl of Sandwich. No one believed him. They left Samuel alone at first. He didn't speak much. He simply sat near the wall, reading the psalter aloud to himself in a voice barely above a whisper. In time, he became known in the ward as the scholar. Prisoners came to him for help writing letters, understanding court documents, composing pleas to their creditors. He never asked for payment, but sometimes they offered scraps of bread or candle ends. He accepted them quietly, with a faint nod. Samuel's cell was shared with 4 others, and though it lacked furniture, one of the men, a former carpenter, had fashioned a makeshift bench from broken boards. At night, they took turns lying on it. Samuel always waited until last. He wrote constantly, with charcoal when ink ran out. Pages of verse, letters never sent, fragments of essays. He spoke of opening a circulating library when he was released. He spoke of publishing sermons for poor parsons who couldn't afford printing. He spoke of forgiveness, too, but never asked for it. After 6 weeks, Samuel fell ill. A fever took hold, likely typhus, which moved through the prison like whispered fire. The other prisoners tried to care for him, offering what little they could. One man traded a pair of shoes for a doctor's visit, though the doctor stayed only 5 minutes. Samuel died on a Thursday. The chaplain read a few lines over him, and the turnkey sold his belongings. The psalter was passed to a younger prisoner who would later carve Samuel's name into the back cover. His death did not make the papers. No obituary marked the end of his life. He vanished like so many others, folded into the quiet anonymity of the debtor's prison. But his words, his letters, his faded scribbles, lived on in the memories of those who heard them by candlelight. And in a way, he became a kind of legend inside those walls. Not because he escaped. Not because he triumphed. But because he endured. Quietly. Dignified. A man undone not by crime, but by the slow unraveling of hope. Let your breath slow now. The past is filled with voices like Samuel's. Gentle, thoughtful, and slowly forgotten. Next, we'll leave the personal and step into the structural, examining how the prison itself operated. In segment 4, we'll explore the strange economy of the Fleet prison, where debt followed you inside, and even survival had a price. It is one of history's quieter ironies, a contradiction almost too bitter to laugh at, that within the debtor's prison, you still needed money. The punishment for owing coin was to be confined in a place where every breath, every comfort, every scrap of dignity, cost more coin still. Close your eyes and picture the inside of Fleet prison again. Not the broad stone facade you saw from the street, but its innermost corridors and rooms, the ones built not with logic, but with centuries of patchwork construction and human desperation. Fleet prison wasn't designed all at once. It grew over time, a knot of architecture and custom, shaped by money as much as by masonry. There were no uniform cells. Instead, there were rooms, closets, galleries, and open courtyards. And everything, absolutely everything, came with a price tag. Upon entry, a prisoner would be charged garnish. This was an unofficial fee paid to the current prisoners. A kind of initiation toll, collected with the force of long tradition. To refuse to pay garnish was to invite days of harassment, verbal abuse, even beatings. The turnkey, the officer responsible for managing prisoners, usually took a cut. If you had money, you could bribe your way into the master's side of the prison. This was the more tolerable area, with private rooms available for rent. These weren't luxurious, but they offered privacy, bedding, and quiet. Some even had windows that opened. You could bring in food, hire a servant, and, if you had the means, live a life not too far removed from the outside. There are recorded cases of well-off debtors living in relative comfort for years, inviting guests, dining from pewter plates, and even continuing business ventures from within their rented rooms. Some of these inmates were lawyers, politicians, or businessmen. They were confined, yes, but only in body. Their lives ticked on. Then there was the common side. This was where the poorest debtors lived, men, women, and children, jammed into large, filthy rooms, often with no bedding at all. The floors were straw-covered, at best. There was no fire in winter. The roof leaked. Rats were frequent visitors. The air was thick with mold and the smell of too many people crammed too tightly together. Food was not provided by the state. There was no central kitchen, no guaranteed meal. You ate only what could be brought to you or by family, friends, or charity. If no one came, you starved. If you had nothing left, you begged through the bars. There were also taprooms within the prison, rudimentary taverns operated by inmates or by corrupt turnkeys. Here ale and gin flowed freely, at a cost. Gambling was common. So were debts within debts. It was not unusual for a prisoner to borrow money while imprisoned for borrowing money. The cycle fed itself. Even the act of sending a letter, petitioning a creditor, writing to family, asking for mercy, cost money. Paper, ink, sealing wax, and the favor of someone to carry the message. All came with a price. The poor relied on the charity of others, or simply gave up on the outside world altogether. One could even rent furniture from other inmates. A shared bed, a wooden stool, a teapot. Some prisoners turned to crafting or selling services within the prison. There were barbers, tailors, even shoemakers among the inmates, trading their skills for a crust of bread or a borrowed candle. The turnkey system itself was a business. Turnkeys were not salaried government workers in the modern sense. They made their money from fees, bribes, and a cut of every transaction that took place. They controlled access to rooms, to privileges, even to air and light. If you angered them, or couldn't pay, they might move you to a colder room, or deny you visitors, or simply ignore your illness. Some prisoners formed clubs or syndicates, pooling their resources to buy firewood or share a better room. These alliances were often fragile, built on necessity more than trust. And yet, despite all this cruelty, there was a strange kind of community. A rhythm. Rituals developed. New prisoners were given roles. Songs were sung. Jokes passed quietly between beds. The poor often supported each other in small ways, a shared crust, a spot closer to the fire. In a system built to punish, people still found ways to care. In 1729, a man named James Dalton wrote of his time in the Fleet, describing the prison as a world within the world, where shillings rule like kings, and no favor falls for free. His words captured the essence of the place. Debt had brought them there. And debt defined every moment they spent within. Let your mind wander through those strange inner marketplaces. Imagine the rows of men at makeshift stalls, whispering offers. Imagine the hushed negotiations over a shared pot of stew. Imagine the quiet despair of a man with nothing left to barter. The Fleet prison was not just a place of confinement. It was a living organism, fed by inequality, shaped by coin, and constantly in motion. Next, we'll pull back again to examine the deeper history of the building itself, its origins, its architectural quirks, and how it evolved from a medieval stronghold to a monument of economic cruelty. Long before Samuel Giddens touched its walls, before the bailiffs and the garnish, before the rented beds and whispered debts, the Fleet prison had already been standing for centuries. Its foundations were old, older than many remembered. Set near the banks of the River Fleet, a waterway that once flowed freely through the city but had long since been choked into a foul, sluggish ditch, the prison took its name from the water, though no one remembered the river fondly. In earlier centuries, it had been cleaner, its banks bordered by mills and market stalls. By the 1700s, it was a stinking channel, black and bubbling, running behind the prison walls like a forgotten artery. The prison's earliest incarnation was medieval, dating as far back as the 12th century. It began not as a debtor's prison at all, but as a general jail, serving the king's courts, housing those awaiting trial or punishment. Its walls were thick, its gates iron-bound. It was never grand. It was never beautiful. But it was useful. Throughout the Middle Ages, the fleet changed hands, burned, was rebuilt, and burned again. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt, it was attacked and severely damaged. Then again, in 1666, the Great Fire of London swept across the city, devouring wood and stone alike. The prison was gutted. Only charred remnants of walls and a few stubborn iron bars remained. Reconstruction began quickly. The city could not function without its prisons. And so, by 1667, a newer fleet began to rise. A mixture of old stone and newer brick, of patched beams and uneven floors. No architect of renown drew up its plans. It was built as a necessity, not a statement. The result was a structure both sprawling and cramped, confusing to outsiders, familiar only to those who had reason to remember every stair, every passage, every blind corner. Its layout was divided into two broad halves, the common side and the master's side. These were not architectural distinctions, but economic ones. The master's side featured private rooms with wooden doors, small hearths, and, occasionally, furniture. Some even had the luxury of wall hangings and writing desks. The common side was the opposite, large rooms filled with bodies and noise, with straw-covered floors and leaking roofs. The central yard was open to the sky, though often muddy or littered with refuse. Prisoners would gather there during the day, leaning against the walls or exchanging goods. A large water butt stood in the corner, filled with rainwater, though it was rarely clean. Sometimes, the yard would host sermons. Other times, fights. But most days, it was just another place to stand and wait. Along one side of the prison stood the taproom, where gin and ale were sold, again, at a price. Drunkenness was common, even encouraged. It softened the weight of the days. Nearby, a small chapel sat quietly, its pews uneven, its altar worn. Few attended services regularly, but many came when death approached. The upper floors were reachable by staircases of stone or narrow wood, some so steep and warped they seemed more like ladders. These floors held the best rooms, reserved for the richest debtors. Here, the ceilings were higher, the windows larger, and the sound of the common yard below just a dull murmur. The lower levels were colder, damper, and darker. These were not dungeons in the traditional sense, but they were worse in their own way. Rooms might flood in rainstorms. Mice and insects lived comfortably in the walls. Mold bloomed on every available surface. The prison had no uniform lighting. Tallow candles were used sparingly. At night, shadows ruled the hallways, and those who had no light of their own simply sat in the dark. It was not uncommon to hear murmured songs echoing through the silence, or the sudden rattle of chains as someone stirred in their sleep. And then there were the cells within cells, little rooms set aside for punishment or isolation. The most notorious was a room called the strong room, often used for those who had violated the prison's informal codes or refused to pay garnish. It was a narrow cell, windowless, with walls that sweated even in winter. Some spent days there. Some, weeks. Despite all this, the Fleet prison was not cut off from the city. In fact, it had its own strange permeability. Many prisoners were allowed to walk the streets during the day under a peculiar system known as the liberty of the Fleet. If they had posted a bond and paid their fees, they could leave the walls and return in the evening. It was one of the oddities of the time, a system of confinement that didn't always confine. These liberties, however, were fragile. If you offended the wrong person, missed a fee, or crossed an invisible line, your privileges could be revoked without warning. The prison was also surrounded by Fleet Market, a bustling row of stalls and vendors who catered to the families and visitors of prisoners. One could buy bread, cheese, writing supplies, even gifts. The irony was not lost on those inside, a prison surrounded by commerce. Let your thoughts rest gently on the stones of that building. The uneven masonry, the old bricks patched with mortar, the rusted locks, and weather-worn beams. These structures were not elegant. They were functional, tired, and soaked in centuries of silent suffering. The fleet stood not as a monument, but as a mirror, reflecting a society that punished poverty not by lifting it, but by hiding it away behind bars and hoping it would disappear. And still, every morning, the sun crept across its outer walls. Pigeons nested in the eaves. Children passed by, tugging at their mothers' sleeves. The city lived on, indifferent to the lives stored inside. Next, we will return to the human element, exploring the lives of women who found themselves behind those same walls. In segment 6, we'll step into the world of female debtors, mothers, wives, widows, and the strange, gendered truths of incarceration. Picture now a narrow room tucked behind a wooden partition on the common side of the fleet. The ceiling is low, the air thick with dampness and the scent of soot. A tattered curtain flutters in the draught, separating one bedroll from another. And there, in the dimness, sits Mary Bostwick, her arms wrapped tightly around a small child fast asleep against her chest. Mary is not alone. And she is not unique. She is one of hundreds of women who, over the years, passed through the gates of the fleet, not for crimes of violence or scandal, but for unpaid bills, for the debts of absent husbands, for the slow and inescapable descent into poverty that so often came with widowhood or abandonment. Debtors' prisons were not only for men. Though the majority of inmates were male, the system did not discriminate in principle. In practice, it often punished women more harshly, not through violence or length of sentence, but through neglect, through indifference, through the simple fact that the institutions were not built with their needs in mind. Mary's story, like so many others, began with a shop. A small linen stall in Whitechapel that she ran with her husband. When he died of fever, the debts did not die with him. The creditors came, polite at first, then persistent, then legally empowered. She tried to repay what she could. She sold his tools. She sold her own wedding dress. But still, the debts loomed. And one morning, as she boiled oats for her son, a knock came at the door. There was no resistance. Just a quiet acceptance. She wrapped the boy in a shawl, gathered a small parcel of bread, and walked to the fleet without complaint. Once inside, she found herself placed among other women on the common side. There was no nursery. No provisions for children. No assistance. If she was to survive, she would have to rely on charity from outside, or the cautious kindness of other inmates. Some women, like Mary, arrived with children in tow. Others gave birth inside. There are records of infants born on straw pallets in the fleet, their first breath drawn amid chains and whispered prayers. Midwives were rarely present. Assistance came from fellow prisoners, most of whom had little more to offer than warm hands and soft voices. Unlike male prisoners, women rarely had trades they could ply within the prison. There were no carpentry tools, no tailoring contracts. A few offered laundry services. Some took in sewing. Others sold scraps of lace or ribbons. Many simply waited. But some found ways to survive. There was Elizabeth Gifford, who wrote letters for male inmates in exchange for bread and candles. She had beautiful handwriting and a sharp mind, and though she never received formal schooling, she taught herself to read from a torn Bible and an old almanac. She was known as the letter widow, and her services were quietly sought by those who feared making mistakes in their pleas for mercy. Others, like Margaret Hale, turned to religion, holding small prayer meetings for the women in the early morning hours before the turnkeys' rounds. She wasn't a preacher, but her voice had a softness that calmed the restless. Women would gather around her, listening as she recited passages from memory. And then there were those who disappeared into the shadows, women whose names were never written, who left no trace but a tally mark in a ledger. Forgotten by family, overlooked by law, they faded into the slow rhythm of prison life until one day their corner lay empty. Despite the lack of support, a fragile kind of sisterhood existed. Women shared what they could, an extra crust, a rag for a sick child, a story to pass the time. There was dignity, even there. A muted defiance. Yet suffering lingered beneath the surface. Hygiene was poor. Food was uncertain. Privacy was non-existent. And for mothers, the burden was doubled. If a child cried through the night, there was no escape, no nursery, no door to close. Illness spread quickly among the youngest inmates, and more than one mother left the prison alone, her arms empty. And always, the weight of shame lingered. For a woman, especially, to be imprisoned for debt was seen not only as a financial failure but a moral one. Visitors judged. Friends vanished. Prospects for remarriage, for employment, for forgiveness, diminished with each passing day behind bars. Still, the prison was not without its moments of humanity. Once a month, a group of Quaker women visited the Fleet, bringing bread, linen, and warm broth. They did not proselytize. They simply offered comfort. Their presence was a lifeline for many. So too were the rare visits from family, small hands pressed through bars, a child's drawing slipped beneath a door, a cousin bringing news from the street. Over time, some women were released, not because their debts were paid, but because creditors gave up, or because they were too ill to be of use. Others remained, forgotten, their sentences indefinite, their hope eroding like the mortar between the prison stones. Mary Bostwick remained in the Fleet for 11 months. Her son, Thomas, was 2 when they entered and 3 when they left. She never spoke of what happened during that year. She returned to her brother's home in Lambeth and never reopened a shop. But Thomas, decades later, became a schoolmaster. And in an essay written for his students, he recalled a single memory from that time, a vision of candlelight flickering on a stone wall, and his mother softly humming an old lullaby as he drifted to sleep, safe in her arms, despite the iron bars around them. Let that image settle with you, a woman holding her child in the darkest place, still humming. In the next segment, we'll explore the strange relationship between the Fleet and the outside world, how prisoners could sometimes leave, how families visited, and how debt created not only confinement, but a whole community that blurred the lines between prison and freedom. Imagine a prison where the gate is not always locked. A place where the boundary between the outside world and the inside is porous, shifting, where some prisoners walk freely into the city by day and return by night, their chains invisible, their confinement strangely voluntary. This was the liberty of the Fleet, one of the strangest and most contradictory aspects of debtors' prison life. Unlike criminal incarceration, where escape was punished harshly and freedom tightly controlled, the world of debt was governed by a different logic. The system did not want to house debtors, it wanted them to pay. And how better to earn money than to allow them to go about their business? For a fee, a prisoner could buy access to the liberty. These fees went to the warden of the prison, a man who, in essence, ran the institution as a business. The Crown appointed him, yes, but his income came from the inmates themselves. And allowing certain inmates to leave during the day was good business. Those granted liberty would pay to reside not inside the stone prison itself, but in the surrounding district, Fleet Street, Ludgate Hill, and nearby Shoe Lane. These areas became extensions of the prison, dotted with lodging houses, taverns, and rented rooms occupied by prisoners who were, in name, still confined. These inmates were technically under house arrest. They were expected to stay within the bounds of the Liberty, a loosely defined district known informally by the marshals and the turnkeys. It was not marked by fences or patrols. Instead, it was enforced by reputation and routine. Those who broke the bounds risked being dragged back into the formal prison and losing their privileges. Many prisoners used this peculiar arrangement to continue their trades. A tailor might rent a tiny shop near the Fleet and work by day. A lawyer could still draft documents or consult with clients. A bookseller might run a stall in the market. And at night, they would return to their lodgings, report to the marshal, and be counted as present. It was a strange compromise, neither truly free nor truly imprisoned. For creditors, this system was preferable. A debtor earning money was more likely to repay. For the debtor, it was a lifeline, a chance to preserve dignity, to stay near family, to avoid the degradation of the common wards. But the Liberty was not always safe. The streets were watched. Bailiffs, ever hungry for commission, would occasionally arrest men who strayed too far or appeared to violate the terms of their parole. The fear of rearrest lingered in every errand, every visit to a client, every step beyond the invisible boundary. And yet, the Liberty gave rise to a culture all its own. Within the district, inns and alehouses catered specifically to debtor inmates. There were tailors who only fitted prisoners. Grocers who extended credit to those they knew would return to the prison each night. Even fleet marriages became a notorious feature of this area, irregular but legal ceremonies conducted by rogue clergy for a fee, often without banns or witnesses. They were quick, secretive, and common. Many desperate couples married this way, hoping to secure inheritance rights, legitimacy for children, or a momentary illusion of normal life. Visitors also blurred the boundary between prison and freedom. Those confined inside the Fleet could, with permission and a fee, receive guests. Wives brought food. Fathers brought blankets. Children brought drawings. Some visitors came daily, others rarely. Some brought hope. Others came only to settle scores. The visitor's yard was a peculiar space. Technically part of the prison, but open to the sky and alive with outside voices. Merchants sold penny pies, ink, ribbon, and scraps of meat. Messages were passed. Debts were negotiated. Some even courted love. It is said that, in the late 1740s, a man named Peter Haldane, a watchmaker by trade, proposed to his sweetheart through the bars of the Fleet's eastern yard. She accepted, and they were married the following morning by a Fleet parson in a nearby alehouse, with witnesses drawn from among the inmates. He would remain in prison for 2 more years, but she visited him daily, bringing both affection and supper. There were also darker visits. Creditors who arrived not to offer mercy, but to taunt or extract new promises. Former friends who came to reclaim borrowed goods. Or simply the absence of visits, days when no one came, and a prisoner sat alone, watching the sky shift, wondering if they had been forgotten entirely. Children were sometimes allowed inside, particularly if they were young. They wandered the halls, clutching crusts or dolls, their laughter startling in its brightness. Inmates looked after them together, sharing boiled sweets or simple rhymes. These children saw the prison not as punishment, but as a strange, crowded home. Let yourself walk through that Liberty district in your mind's eye. Imagine the smell of meat pies cooking in a roadside oven, the rustle of paper from a stationer's stall. Picture men in worn coats haggling over ink or bread, their debts never far from their minds. Picture a woman reading aloud through a barred window, her voice steady as the sky dims. The Liberty of the Fleet was a place where freedom and imprisonment existed side by side, where debt had not only built walls, but reshaped an entire neighborhood. It was not justice. It was not mercy. But it was something softer than confinement. Something like endurance. In the next segment, we'll return to the inside of the prison to examine another layer of this peculiar world, the courtroom within the walls. In segment 8, we'll explore the rules of court, the process of petitioning for release, and the subtle art of navigating legal limbo from behind bars. Imagine, for a moment, a large, timber-beamed room inside the Fleet. Not as dark or crowded as the wards, but filled with tension all the same. At one end stands a raised dais, where a magistrate occasionally sits. Below, a scattering of benches. The scent of old paper, wax seals, and damp wool fills the air. No shouting. No wigs. Just the quiet shuffling of documents and the soft creak of floorboards. This was the prison courtroom, a place where prisoners did not protest their innocence, but pleaded for mercy, compromise, or release. It was not a dramatic arena, but a slow-moving cog in the legal machinery that governed debt in England. For many inmates of the Fleet, this room represented their only hope. Here, prisoners could petition for relief, a formal request for release or leniency. Not because they had paid their debts, but because they were now destitute, or because their imprisonment served no useful purpose. Some petitions were written by hand. Others were copied by professional scriveners inside the prison for a fee. Spelling and grammar mattered less than tone, sincerity, and timing. A typical petition began with an address to the court or the warden. It described the prisoner's condition, their efforts to repay, their family's suffering. It might reference illness, lost employment, the death of a spouse. Some were tearful. Others coldly practical. All hoped to sway the minds of those with power. There were also pleas for discharge under insolvency acts, special laws passed periodically by Parliament that allowed qualifying debtors to be released if they surrendered their remaining assets. These were not automatic. They required paperwork, witness statements, and time. Weeks, sometimes months. To begin the process, a prisoner would submit a formal schedule of debts and assets, a written list of what they owed, to whom, and what they still possessed. For many, this final step was humiliating. They listed broken furniture, unpaid tailor's bills, borrowed waistcoats, even wedding rings. It laid bare their lives. If approved, the prisoner would appear in this very courtroom, clothed in their best coat, if they had one, standing before a magistrate or clerk. There were no juries. No grand speeches. Just quiet questions. Did you make every reasonable effort to repay? Have you concealed any income? Is there anyone still willing to support you? Answers were given softly. Sometimes tearfully. Occasionally defiantly. If successful, a certificate of discharge would be issued, and the prisoner released, free to leave the prison, though not always free of debt. Some creditors still pursued them. Some lost all. Some simply disappeared. But the system had loopholes. Creditors had the right to object to a debtor's release, claiming fraud or bad faith. A single objection could stall the entire process. In those cases, the matter would return to the court for more hearings, more delays, more costs. There was also the matter of fees. Even those discharged by law were expected to pay court costs, document fees, turnkey gratuities. If they could not, they might remain inside, freed but confined, a cruel paradox that trapped many in place for months after their legal sentence had ended. And for those too poor, too ill, or too illiterate to navigate the system, the courtroom might as well have been another cell. Many never applied at all. They simply faded into the walls. Within the Fleet, a quiet caste of legal scribes emerged, prisoners who charged small sums to draft petitions, advise on filings, or translate legal Latin into plain English. They were not lawyers. But they knew the system, and their services were in constant demand. One such man was Thomas Liddell, a former law clerk imprisoned for gambling debts. His cell was a narrow alcove on the master's side, where he kept a desk, 2 chairs, and a battered copy of Coke on Littleton. Prisoners would visit him by candlelight, dictating their stories. He charged a halfpenny per page and was said to be meticulous, if rather stern. Liddell once helped a washerwoman named Ellen Wren secure her release after 2 years of confinement. Her debt? A borrowed shawl and a pair of shoes, pawned to buy medicine for her child. Her petition, drafted in Liddell's firm hand, moved a magistrate enough to forgive the costs. She left quietly one morning, never returning. The court was not always cruel. But it was slow. Bureaucracy wrapped in ritual. Justice, not denied, but delayed. For those with time and patience, the court could offer a path home. But many, too tired, too bitter, too afraid, never entered that chamber. They sat in the yard, watching the sky, waiting for some other door to open. Let your thoughts rest now on the fragile parchment, the careful ink lines, the waxy feel of seals pressed by weary hands. Imagine the quiet tension in the courtroom. The hush before a name is called. The long breath held as fate is weighed. In our next segment, we'll turn to the voices of reform writers, preachers, and parliamentarians who visited the Fleet and began to ask uncomfortable questions. In segment 9, we'll explore how the outside world slowly awakened to the inhumanity within. In the early years of the 18th century, the Fleet prison stood largely unchallenged. It was seen as an unpleasant necessity, an instrument of commerce, a consequence of poor judgment, and, to many, a deserved punishment. But as the decades passed, that view began to shift. Not quickly. Not dramatically. But subtly, like the tide working its slow way beneath a rotting dock. The change began with observation, with a few brave voices daring to look closely and describe what they saw. One of the earliest and most influential of these voices was James Oglethorpe, a young member of Parliament who, in the 1720s, served on a committee investigating the condition of Britain's prisons. Oglethorpe, who would later found the colony of Georgia, was both pragmatic and idealistic. He had friends who had suffered imprisonment for debt, and he believed that poverty was not always the product of vice. Under his guidance, a team of investigators visited several prisons across London, including the Fleet. What they found disturbed even hardened politicians. They documented rooms overflowing with prisoners, some lying on bare stone floors, others crammed together so tightly they could not lie down at all. They recorded instances of extortion by wardens and turnkeys, of prisoners kept in chains until their families paid bribes, of women giving birth unaided, of children dying from cold and hunger while their parents watched helplessly. Their report, presented in Parliament in 1729, was not written in the inflammatory style of modern exposés. It was calm, factual, and deeply damning. A particular passage described how prisoners in the common ward of the Fleet lay upon straw that was not changed from month to month, amidst their own filth, without light or air, and that many expired in silence, being too weak to cry out. This report sparked outrage, at least among reformers and the reading public. Pamphlets began to circulate. Clergy began to speak more frequently from the pulpit about the sin not just of debt, but of society's indifference to suffering. The Quakers, in particular, became advocates for prison reform, visiting inmates, documenting abuses, and publishing treatises that called for compassion and mercy. Writers, too, began to take notice. Daniel Defoe, himself once imprisoned in a debtor's prison, had written years earlier about the injustices of a system that punished poverty with greater poverty. Though his works often masked their messages within fiction, his readers could not miss the allusions. But perhaps the most haunting accounts came not from novelists or politicians, but from prisoners themselves. In 1733, a small book appeared in London shops under the unassuming title, The Life and Sufferings of John Baker, Late of Fleet Prison. It was a quiet narrative, simply written, filled with dry detail and gentle phrasing. But its effect was profound. Baker described how he entered the Fleet owing only £18, a manageable sum, by many standards. Yet within a year, his debts had doubled due to fees, garnish, and the cost of staying alive. His health declined. His wife left him. His 2 children died of illness within the walls. He wrote not with rage, but with sadness. And perhaps that made the story more powerful. Other accounts followed. Petitions to Parliament. Letters to newspapers. Even sermons printed and sold for a penny apiece, describing the prison as a house of despair built on the bones of the poor. Still, reform was slow. The Fleet was a private enterprise, and many in government were reluctant to interfere with the rights of prison wardens to manage their affairs. After all, they argued, should not debtors be grateful for shelter, for a roof, for a chance to work off what they owed? But pressure continued to build. Philanthropic societies formed. Charities began to pay off small debts, freeing men and women who had lingered in prison for years over a few shillings. Some judges began to question the morality of sending the poor to a place where they would only become poorer. And Parliament, over the years, passed a slow trickle of insolvency acts, laws that allowed certain categories of debtors to be released if they met conditions. These laws were narrow and often temporary, but they chipped away at the idea that debt should mean indefinite confinement. The 1760s and 70s saw a growing number of writers, often middle-class observers, visit prisons like the Fleet and publish their findings. They described not only the dirt and the crowding, but the psychological decay, the hopelessness, the erosion of dignity, the strange rituals that prisoners developed to pass the time or preserve a shred of identity. They described the quiet prisoners, the ones who never shouted, who never begged, who simply sat and watched the light change on the wall. By the early 19th century, momentum had shifted. Public sentiment no longer viewed debtors' prisons as simply unfortunate. Increasingly, they were seen as barbaric. And yet, the Fleet remained open. Its domes stood. Its rooms still filled with the poor. Its doors still opened each morning for a new generation of the desperate. True reform, as always, took time. But the world was watching now. And watching, eventually, becomes action. Let your thoughts settle now on the image of an aging prison clerk sitting by candlelight, copying out yet another petition, as outside the gates, a newspaper boy calls out the latest report from Parliament. A quiet bridge is forming between 2 worlds, ink-connecting voices that once lived in silence. In the next segment, we'll take a closer look at one of the more curious aspects of life in the Fleet, the ceremonies and customs developed by the prisoners themselves, a culture that mimicked the world outside, even as it twisted it. Inside the Fleet prison, time did not move like it did outside. There were no schedules governed by bells, no formal work shifts or school hours. Days blurred. Nights stretched long. And in that liminal space, between freedom and confinement, hope and despair, an entire subculture took root. It was a culture both playful and grim. Rich in traditions, many of which were never written down. Developed not by wardens or lawmakers, but by the inmates themselves. Passed from mouth to ear, from generation to generation, whispered in shadow and shouted in jest. Imagine yourself in the common yard on a rare sunny afternoon. The stone underfoot is warm, and a handful of prisoners are gathered near a corner, laughing, not in cruelty, but in ceremony. A newcomer has arrived, and they are about to go through what many called the mock court. This ceremony, though entirely informal, carried real weight among the prisoners. A sort of initiation rite, it served as a blend of entertainment, social sorting, and, strangely, community building. The court had its own judge, typically an elder prisoner who had resided in the Fleet for months or years. He might wear a paper crown or a hat festooned with buttons and feathers, sitting upon an overturned barrel. The accused, newly arrived and often bewildered, would be brought forward, made to stand while mock charges were read aloud. "You are hereby accused," the judge would declare solemnly, "of entering this esteemed establishment without presenting the customary tribute to His Most Miserable Majesty, the King of Straw." The garnish was demanded, a small gift of food, drink, or a few pence. Failure to pay could result in mock penalties, being made to sweep the yard with a broken broom, sing a tune before the crowd, or spend the night on the coldest step in the stairwell. All in jest, but with an edge. Refusing to participate could mean social isolation, an unspoken sentence worse than the jest itself. This ritual served a purpose. It broke tension. It created bonds. And it allowed long-time prisoners to assert order where none had been imposed by law. Other customs were more solemn. Each Sunday, a kind of gathering would occur, not in the prison chapel, which many avoided, but in the yard itself. A prisoner with a voice like a bell might stand and read a passage from Scripture or a popular book. Around him, others would sit in silence, heads bowed, not always in prayer, but in collective stillness. For many, it was the only moment in the week that resembled peace. Then there were the rites of straw, a name given to the simple, touching tradition surrounding the death of a fellow inmate. When a prisoner died, there was no official ceremony. The warden might note the death in a ledger. A turnkey might arrange for removal. But the other prisoners, they mourned in their own way. They would gather straw from bedding, fashioning a rough wreath or bundle. This symbol, humble and transient, was placed near the cell door, or in the yard, depending on the prisoner's status. Sometimes a few lines were spoken. Sometimes a song was sung. And then, quietly, life moved on. The King of the Ward was another curious title, bestowed upon a prisoner who had stayed the longest, or who had proven particularly clever, generous, or influential. This title came with no real power, but a strange sort of respect. The king would mediate disputes, arrange group cleanings, or negotiate with the turnkeys over candles and coals. It was said that one such king, a man named George Pitt, had reigned in the common side for nearly 6 years. He kept a ledger of the debts owed between inmates, helped newcomers draft letters to creditors, and once organized a rudimentary Christmas feast with funds scraped together from odd jobs. And of course, there were the games. Prisoners played dice with bones carved from soup scraps. They played a form of skittles using buttons and pebbles. They gambled with tokens made from wood or marked bits of cloth. Card games were common, though full decks were rare. Rules were often invented on the spot. The stakes? Bread, warmth, respect. Some of these rituals bordered on performance. A prisoner might take on a persona, a mock nobleman, a ship captain, even a clergyman, and host imaginary suppers, complete with grand speeches and toasts made with empty mugs. These charades, equal parts theatre and coping mechanism, helped pass the long evenings when the shadows grew thick and the air turned cold. There was music, too. Flutes made from tin pipes. Harmonicas smuggled in. A man with a baritone voice who sang old folk songs learned from his mother in the north. On feast days, or what passed for them, these tunes filled the corridors, lifting spirits and, for a moment, making the walls feel less heavy. Even in such darkness, the human spirit found ways to create rhythm. To impose ceremony on the shapeless. To find pattern where there was only waiting. Let your mind drift now to a stone corridor lit by candle stubs, where a group of men sit cross-legged, whispering riddles. One of them chuckles softly, taps a friend on the arm, and recites the same line he told the week before, familiar but comforting. Outside the barred window, the wind shifts, but no one listens. They are here, together, and that is enough. In our next segment, we will peer into the world of the elite. Not those who suffered behind the bars, but those who passed by in carriages, dined in Fleet Street taverns, and debated over claret whether debt was a moral failing or a societal flaw. Beyond the Fleet's grim walls, the city of London thrummed with elegance and ambition. Townhouses rose behind high iron gates. Gentlemen gathered in coffee-houses to discuss politics and trade. Ladies promenaded through gardens in silks and lace. In these circles, the subject of debt was both ever-present and delicately avoided. Debt, after all, was not exclusive to the poor. Many among the gentry and upper classes lived on the edge of insolvency, funding their carriages, wardrobes, and country estates through complex networks of credit, loans, and promissory notes. They borrowed from friends, bankers, merchants. They speculated in stocks, land, even rumors. Fortunes could be made, or lost, before breakfast. But here, debt was masked. Managed. Spoken of in euphemism. To owe money was a mark of participation in society, so long as one still held standing. As long as the creditors were patient, the debts remained a private inconvenience. Only when patience wore thin, when letters went unanswered, or payments missed, did the curtain lift. And for some, that fall from grace led directly to the Fleet. When a gentleman was imprisoned for debt, the elite response varied. Some quietly arranged settlements, paid off the creditor, and whisked the matter out of public view. Others disavowed the debtor entirely, cutting ties, erasing names from guest lists, speaking in hushed tones about poor Charles or unfortunate Edmund. For women of the upper classes, the situation was more precarious. A father's or husband's debt could cast a long shadow. A family might be shunned, marriage prospects ruined, reputations irreparably stained. Though rarely imprisoned themselves, elite women bore the social cost of debt in silence. Fleet Street, which bordered the prison, served as a curious meeting ground between these worlds. Along this bustling thoroughfare, taverns, coffee-houses, and shops stood cheek by jowl with pawnbrokers and printers. Lawyers' offices opened above noisy alehouses. Newsboys shouted headlines while bankers swept into marble-floored counting-houses. And amidst it all, wealthy Londoners would sometimes pause, glance toward the Fleet's high walls, and murmur about the latest scandal. "Did you hear?" a merchant's wife might whisper to a friend over tea. "Lord Halberry, imprisoned over a gaming debt. Quite disgraceful." "Unthinkable," her companion would reply. "I suppose his family will quietly see to it." They usually do. This distance, this sense that debt was acceptable when managed, shameful only when exposed, defined elite attitudes. The poor were expected to suffer their fate. The wealthy were expected to avoid it. Yet curiosity lingered. It became fashionable, in certain elite circles, to visit the Fleet as a sort of grotesque diversion. Young men on the town would tour the prison, speak to inmates, perhaps toss a few coins to the more colorful residents. It was said that some ladies, escorted by chaperones, would peer through the gates from their carriages, murmuring about the wretchedness within. For others, the prison became a cautionary tale. Playwrights and pamphleteers often used the image of the debtor's prison to warn against vice and frivolity. In drawing rooms, the name Fleet conjured images not of walls and chains, but of shame, of social ruin. One satirical print from the period shows a young dandy being dragged by bailiffs while a woman swoons nearby, and a speech bubble proclaims, to Fleet with him, for living beyond his means. But not all the elite turned away. Some, stirred by personal loss or moral conviction, became quiet advocates for reform. A few members of Parliament, whose own sons or cousins had spent time in the Fleet, pushed for gentler insolvency laws. Some merchants formed charitable societies to pay the debts of deserving cases, particularly former military men or widows with children. Still, the divide remained vast. Inside the prison, a man might starve for lack of a shilling. Outside, another might lose 10,000 at cards in a single evening and be applauded for his daring. And yet, debt haunted both. It crept beneath velvet waistcoats and rough linen alike. It whispered behind ledgers and lingered in letters. It was, in truth, the invisible scaffold upon which much of society was built. Let your thoughts rest now on the image of a carriage rolling past the Fleet at dusk, the curtains drawn, the passengers within murmuring about the cold, the noise, the disgrace of it all, never pausing to wonder how many among them might be only one bad wager, one failed investment, one forgotten payment away from those same gates. In the next segment, we'll explore how debt affected families across class lines. How imprisonment didn't only punish the debtor, but rippled outward, altering lives, futures, and generations. Imagine a narrow row house in Southwark. A kettle hisses gently on the hearth, and outside, the winter wind stirs the soot-blackened air. Inside, 3 children huddle on a threadbare rug. Their mother moves slowly, carefully, folding linens that no longer smell of lavender, only of damp wool and ash. Her hands tremble not from cold, but from the weight of worry. Her husband is only 2 miles away, at the Fleet. He has been there for 11 months. This is the quiet devastation of debtor's prison. A man might be confined, but the punishment never stopped at the cell door. It rippled outward, transforming ordinary lives into slow-moving tragedies. The law made no provision for the welfare of a debtor's family. If a man was imprisoned, his wife and children were not entitled to relief, nor protected from eviction or hunger. The assumption was simple. Either the family would pay the debt, or they would fall with him. Some tried to survive through charity. Churches provided bread tokens or second-hand clothing. Philanthropic societies might offer a few shillings. Neighbors might step in, at first. But compassion had limits, and poverty was contagious. Others sought work. Wives became laundresses, seamstresses, or wet nurses. Children sold matches in the street or sang outside taverns for coins. A few families took in lodgers. Single men with thick boots and hungry eyes, just to keep the landlord at bay. Even so, the toll was heavy. Many women aged prematurely. With little to spare for food, and less for warmth, illness took root. Coughs lingered. Teeth darkened. Eyes dulled. And always, the question, when would he come home? Some families tried to visit. They gathered up the few coins they had and made their way to the Fleet on Sunday afternoons. The journey itself was a ritual. Crossing the narrow bridges, dodging carts and dung heaps, passing under the cold gaze of the cathedral towers. And then, the gates. Visitors were subject to rules and fees. A turnkey might demand a penny for entry. Another might ask for a gratuity to escort them to the right cell. Once inside, they had little privacy. Mothers fed their infants while perched on rough benches. Children played with pebbles in the corners. Conversations were short, often tearful. One boy, Samuel Hargreaves, later wrote of his visits to his father in the Fleet. He remembered the way his father's beard had grown, how his voice had changed, and how, each time they left, his mother walked just a little slower than before. I think, he wrote, she hoped, if she walked slowly enough, he might catch up to her somehow. For some women, hope eventually turned to desperation. There are records of wives pawning their wedding rings to raise enough money to pay a turnkey for extra firewood. Others sold the shoes off their children's feet. Some turned to begging. A few, though rarely spoken of, resorted to what polite society called low arrangements, exchanging their dignity for coin. Debt affected inheritance, too. A man imprisoned for debt could not leave property to his children. His estate was considered forfeit. This meant that even after his death, the weight of the debt continued to press down on those he left behind. It's important to understand that this was not unusual. Thousands of families experienced some version of this. Even among the working class, the emotional impact was enormous. Children learned to associate the fleet not just with confinement, but with shame. Some changed their names to escape the association. Others grew up with a deep mistrust of systems, of promises, of stability. And yet, amid the suffering, there were moments of resilience. Some families managed to hold together, writing letters weekly, sending what food they could. Some women formed informal support networks, helping one another with childcare, sharing scraps of meat, mending garments together by candlelight. Some children found their way to charity schools, where they learned to read and write, and to remember. In time, some fathers were released. Reunions were bittersweet. A man returned not to the life he had left, but to a family aged, a home changed, a child who now looked at him with eyes older than their years. Others never came home. Let yourself imagine, now, a family seated at a small table. The mother cuts bread into equal pieces, her hands slow and practiced. A single candle glows. The eldest child stirs a pot of thin stew. And in the corner, a letter rests unopened, its wax seal broken, its words known by heart. It is from the fleet. It says little. But it says enough. Debt, you see, did not simply imprison the man. It hollowed out his absence and placed it in the center of the family's life. In our next segment, we will leave behind the human stories for a while and look instead at the bones of the place itself, the architecture and layout of the Fleet prison. How did the shape of its walls define the shape of its suffering? The Fleet prison, like many buildings in London, had lived several lives. Its earliest incarnation dated back to the 12th century, positioned along the western edge of the old Roman wall. Over centuries, it had burned, been rebuilt, expanded, and revised. By the 18th century, it was a tangle of walls, staircases, courtyards, and rooms of every size and temperament, a place less like a fortress and more like a decaying city within a city. Imagine yourself approaching the structure from the east, walking along Fleet Street. You would see a squat, soot-darkened exterior, pierced by barred windows and surrounded by high walls, not so much forbidding as exhausted. The main entrance was through a gatehouse, where a turnkey, seated on a worn stool, would record names and collect fees before granting passage. Once inside, the prison unfurled not in straight lines but in uneven layers. At the center was the main quadrangle, often referred to simply as the yard. This open-air space was paved in stone, bordered by low steps and surrounded by arched walkways. It was here that prisoners took air, conducted business, or simply stared at the changing sky. The walls around it rose like canyon faces, pocked with windows, some broken, some sealed with cloth or shutters. To one side of the yard was the master's side, the area reserved for those who could afford better conditions. These rooms, though far from luxurious, offered greater privacy. A typical chamber on the master's side was perhaps 8 feet wide by 10 feet deep, with a narrow bed, a shelf, and, if fortune allowed, a fireplace. Walls were damp. Floors creaked. but the doors had locks that the prisoner, rather than the jailer, sometimes controlled. The common side, by contrast, was chaos. There, large communal rooms, some carved from what had once been storage cellars, housed dozens of prisoners at once. Straw covered the floors. Water leaked from the ceilings. Windows were few. The air grew stale in summer and bitingly damp in winter. At night, the only light came from tallow candles or the embers of shared hearths. Rats were common, fleas inevitable. Moving upward, you would find wooden galleries, narrow walkways that ran along the inner sides of the building, with doors leading to small rooms and cells. These galleries were treacherous in poor weather, slippery when wet, creaky and soft beneath the foot in places where time had worn the wood thin. The warden's house stood apart. Technically within the prison compound, it was a separate structure entirely, larger, cleaner, and facing inward upon the misery it governed. It featured a drawing room, offices, and a small library. The warden himself was rarely seen beyond its threshold. He managed the prison as one might manage an inn, concerned with balance sheets and staff behavior more than the lives of the men and women confined under his watch. Beneath the entire complex ran cellars and subterranean passages. Dark, unused corridors that once stored grain or weaponry and were now inhabited by shadows. Some served as unofficial punishment cells. Others were sealed off entirely. A few prisoners told tales of men who had vanished into those lower levels, their names scratched faintly into the stone walls, left behind like unanswered questions. And then there were the latrines, simple shafts and buckets, emptied irregularly, often venting their stench back into the living quarters. The fleet sanitation was poor, even by the standards of the day. Outbreaks of disease were not rare, and the design of the building did little to prevent the spread. There were no quarantine rooms. No infirmary. Just corners and distance. Despite this, the prison was not entirely without design. There were distinct routes, one for staff, one for visitors, one for prisoners who paid to move between wards. These paths twisted around each other like vines, separate, yet sharing the same soil. One curious architectural feature was the writing wall near the western stairwell, a patch of plaster where inmates, over the years, had inscribed their names, poems, prayers, and jokes. Some were dates. Some were initials. Others were longer, carved with nails or charcoal. Here died the hope of John S. 1744. God sees us even here. Monday again. Above the yard was a bell tower, long out of use. The bell, once rung to announce escapes or fires, had fallen silent. Its clapper had been removed. Still, prisoners sometimes looked up at it as they passed beneath, wondering whether it would ever ring again. The layout of the fleet did more than organize bodies. It shaped minds. The lack of privacy wore down the will. The dimness blurred the sense of time. The cold stone encouraged silence. Many prisoners reported hallucinations, not wild or terrifying, but slow, creeping illusions. Footsteps that never arrived, voices whispering through the pipes, dreams indistinguishable from waking. Architectural choices, often unintentional, had psychological consequences. Cells without windows bred despair. Corridors without end created restlessness. Even the sound of distant traffic, filtered through thick stone and echoing hallways, reminded prisoners that life outside was moving on without them. And yet, some adapted. They carved niches into walls to hold candles. They painted walls with coal dust and grease to imitate wallpaper. They constructed makeshift partitions to simulate privacy. They hung curtains from rope. They found ways to fold comfort into the creases of the building's indifference. Let your mind now wander through those stone hallways, your steps soft upon worn wooden stairs, your breath mingling with the stillness of rooms that have not changed for decades. Imagine the slow creak of a door opening onto nothing but shadow. Feel the way the very shape of the place bends time, softens edges, and holds silence like a bowl holds water. In the next segment, we will rise back into the city above, to see how London itself responded to the gradual disappearance of places like the Fleet. How reform came, not in a single moment, but in slow tides of law, economics, and shifting human conscience. By the early 19th century, the tide of history had begun to wash against the foundations of the Fleet prison. Slowly, then suddenly, the world that had once tolerated its presence began to shift. London was growing taller, busier, richer. New philosophies stirred in coffee houses. Parliamentary debates stretched longer. And beneath it all, a quiet revolution in conscience had begun. It was no longer possible to ignore the question, what, exactly, was accomplished by keeping men in cages for owing money? Public sentiment, long dormant, began to awaken. Campaigners had spent decades chipping away at public indifference. Writers, pamphleteers, and preachers had painted the prison in clearer light. The Industrial Revolution brought not only machines and smoke, but a new idea of what a productive society should be, and it increasingly found no place for institutions that wasted human potential behind stone walls. In 1835, a government commission undertook a systematic review of the country's prisons, and what they found in the Fleet was nothing short of archaic. The report described the prison as overcrowded, unsanitary, and outdated in both design and purpose. The idea of imprisoning a man for debt, a civil issue, not a criminal act, was no longer seen as justifiable, especially when it often made repayment impossible. Even the courts began to shift. Judges increasingly questioned the logic of committing debtors who clearly lacked the means to pay. Some began recommending voluntary arrangements and debt forgiveness schemes, supported by growing insolvency legislation. Then, in 1842, the ground truly shifted. That year, the British Parliament passed the Insolvent Debtors Act, a sweeping law that curtailed the use of imprisonment for private debts. Under this new law, most debtors could no longer be confined indefinitely. They were required to surrender their assets and demonstrate good faith, but if they did, they were spared the cell. The law still had its limits, and enforcement varied. But it marked the beginning of the end. The Fleet, now increasingly empty, clung to life like a ruin unwilling to collapse. Its rooms stood half full. Its turnkeys grew idle. The warden, once powerful, now oversaw a place that felt more like an echo than an institution. In 1844, Parliament finally issued the order: the Fleet prison would close. Its remaining prisoners were transferred to other facilities. Some were released outright. The gates, once clanging with constant motion, fell silent. And for the first time in centuries, no new names were written in the debtor's ledger. After its closure, the building stood for a time, decaying gently into the London fog. Writers mourned and celebrated it in equal measure. Charles Dickens, who had visited the prison and drawn inspiration from its architecture and its inmates, spoke of its closure as a symbolic moment. In his novel Little Dorrit, he captured the strange blend of ritual and ruin that defined places like the Fleet, its ability to entangle souls as well as bodies. For a while, the empty shell was used for storage. Then, in 1846, it was demolished. The stones were carted away. Some were reused. Others simply disappeared. In their place rose new streets, new buildings, new dreams. The past, as it so often does, was paved over. But the memory lingered. And not just in books. You can still walk the old path of the Fleet River, long since buried beneath Farringdon Street. The street names: Fleet Lane, Farringdon Road, Shoe Lane, still whisper the old geography. A few carved stones survive in museum collections. A single fragment of iron grille, bent slightly at the middle, sits in a glass case in the Museum of London. More profoundly, the closure of the Fleet marked a turning point in how society viewed debt. Over the coming decades, laws continued to evolve. The Debtors Act of 1869 finally abolished imprisonment for most debts altogether, save for cases involving fraud or willful non-payment. New mechanisms emerged: bankruptcy courts, financial regulation, credit bureaus, to manage the same problems without bars and bolts. Though never perfect, they represented a profound shift from punishment to prevention, from confinement to correction. And yet, even in a world without debtors' prisons, the legacy lingers. Debt remains a force that can upend lives. Its language may be different now: interest rates, credit scores, default notices, but its emotional weight endures. Fear, shame, silence. These too are prisons, invisible but real. Let your mind now rest on an image both quiet and hopeful: a grey London dawn, the last stones of the Fleet being removed one by one, revealing sky where once there was shadow. A boy watches from across the street, holding his father's hand. Neither speaks. But the world has changed. In the next and final segment, we'll take a gentle step back and reflect on all we've seen, on the strange endurance of places like the Fleet, and on the comforts of the present that lie just beyond our dreams. In the silence that follows the closing of the gates, in the breath between footsteps down an empty corridor, something lingers. A stillness. A memory. A whisper of the lives that passed, unnoticed, beneath stone and sky. The Fleet prison is gone. Its walls dismantled. Its stairwells unrevealed. Its ledger closed and archived. Yet, as with many of history's quiet places, its story does not end with demolition. It lives on. Not in headlines or parades, but in the slow, deliberate turning of pages like this one. In the world we occupy now, debt still exists. Bills still arrive. Balances still shift and stretch. But the notion that poverty should mean confinement has, for the most part, faded into history. And this is not because we became wealthier or more efficient. It is because, somewhere along the winding road, we became more compassionate. The Fleet teaches us that injustice is rarely loud. It does not always shout. Sometimes, it settles like dust into the corners of daily life, hidden in routine, disguised as order. And sometimes, it takes centuries for enough people to notice. But notice, they did. Activists who walked the corridors with ink-stained hands. Lawmakers who dared to ask different questions. Writers who whispered truth through fiction. Families who endured, quietly, and waited for the walls to fall. Perhaps most quietly of all, those who lived and died behind those iron bars left behind not noise, but resilience. In their carved initials. In their songs. In their straw rituals and mock trials and Sunday sermons whispered over bowls of broth. They left behind a kind of soft defiance, a reminder that even where freedom is denied, meaning can still be made. And now, as you lay here, warm and safe, the air steady and the quiet deep, you might imagine, just faintly, that same moonlight which once spilled through the narrow windows of a Fleet cell now rests gently on your windowsill. That same breeze, once slipping through rusted bars, now moves softly across your room. The present is not perfect, but it is gentle in ways the past rarely was. You do not lie on stone. You are not kept behind bolts and locks for the price of a missed payment. You have light. You have breath. You have the space to rest, not as a privilege, but as a given. Let the story of the Fleet settle now like paper on a desk. The pages closed. The ink dried. Its echoes fading not into nothing, but into stillness. Into calm. Into sleep. And should your mind wander again to those narrow cells or shadowed halls, let it do so gently, knowing that even within such walls, humanity persisted. Quietly. Fully. Unbroken. Good night, dear listener. And rest well.